Honourable Member Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Well, look, that was a very useful and informative contribution by my colleague Darian Fenton, and I too would be very interested in knowing the views of the member Tau Hanare about the title of this bill and why the original title had worker in it and what his views are on the striking out of the word worker. So we now have the Employment Relations Struck Out Workers Secret Ballot for Strikes Amendment Bill. Now, employment relations, the first part, obviously this will be a change to the Employment Relations Act. The Employment Relations Act is about the relationship between a number of parties in the workplace, and those parties do in fact include unions and employers and individual workers and individual employers, so both collectively and individually. All of those groups are part of the employment relations that take place in a workplace. So it would be very interesting indeed to know Mr Hanare's views on the striking out of the word workers. And just to follow through on a point that Darian Fenton was making, my understanding is the UK legislation deliberately uses the word worker for the very reason that she was identifying, that that is a term that is broader than the word employee and therefore covers the multiplicity of relationships that now exist. And in fact many of those, and that's certainly true in New Zealand, many of those relationships have been established in such a way as to remove rights from people. So employees have a number of rights which don't necessarily apply to other groups, like, for example, contractors. So that term worker is a broader term. But so we're talking about employment relations, and then specifically this bill is around secret ballots for strikes. Now, I would be very interested in really getting to the bottom of why this bill is even here, and why we've wasted time in this House already on this bill, in our Select Committee on this bill, and here again in the Houses, in the Committee of a whole, looking at this bill. This bill is an absolute joke. The submissions we heard made it very clear there was not a problem to be dealt with. And I have to again just reinforce the points that Darian Fenton was making, that if this is a problem, it is a problem that was perceived to be of an earlier time. It is certainly not reflective of the relationships that between unions and their members and between employers in the 2000s. It is not a problem. Generally speaking, secret ballots exist. Generally speaking, in fact, strikes are comparatively rare. And bullying union officials, like the sort of a union official that somebody like Tau Hanare was, is not commonplace. And members opposite might mutter under their breaths about whether we can say that. That is actually a fact. And if people opposite want to hear more about that, I'm sure we could give you more information. But I was a union official for many years in my working life, and I know that I never once stood over a worker. I never once put pressure on a worker to take strike action, and that those decisions were indeed the decisions of the workers concerned, freely made. And that is the only way in common sense that you can see how a strike can take place. You can't force people out the door. You can't lock the door behind them, unless you're the employer, in fact, and keep them out. And the reality is that it is harder and harder in the current environment for workers to get together collectively to take action to try and improve their wages and conditions of employment. It is much harder in periods of high unemployment. It is much harder in a sort of anti-worker and anti-union environment that currently exists, and if National are re-elected will get a whole lot worse. So it isn't easy for workers to take strike action, but the reality is it actually never really has been that easy, because we all know, and just in case members opposite don't know, that if you go on strike, you lose pay. You lose pay. So that's quite hard for the average working person, because they need their wages and salary. They need their wages and salary to live on. Now, going back to the title of this bill, so this is supposedly about secret ballots for strikes, and we will be talking a lot more about industrial action during the course of the evening, because striking is a form of industrial action, and of course the flip side of that is the lockout. Now, the lockout is the employer... Mr Chair?
I call the Honourable Member Kelvin Davis.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair,